This is the lecture for week 6 of Intro to OT. This week we are talking about the OT Practice Framework and the domain of occupational therapy. Our efforts this week are addressing course competency number 6, which states that you will articulate the practice framework domain. Before viewing this lecture, you should skim through the OT Practice Framework and read Chapter 5 of Ryan. You will want to familiarize yourself with the OT Practice Framework terminology and structure. You will be using this throughout your academic career. Before the practice framework was developed and implemented, there were several predecessors to this document used by OT practitioners. You may still hear faculty and clinicians refer to these, as some of the concepts and terms are still useful. So let's start with a history lesson. The OT Product Output Report System and Uniform Terminology. This document was created to fulfill the Department of Health and Human Services requirements for Medicare. Since many OTAs work under Medicare guidelines in hospitals and nursing homes, a document was needed to meet Medicare requirements. It was also created to fulfill requirements for Public Law 94-142, which is a law that covers school-based services, including OT. The document was designed to provide consistent terms for reports. Practitioners at the time seemed to be using their own lexicon and definitions from setting to setting. It was especially helpful for third-party payers and accrediting bodies. The Uniform Terminology number 2. This document expanded on the existing terms, especially the performance areas and components. It was designed to reflect current practice as 10 years had passed since the previous document, and there were newer areas of service and treatments. Uniform Terminology number 3. Again, an update. This time the context section was added, which gave a fuller dimension and clearer articulation as to how we viewed the person using occupation. It was also updated and expanded to reflect an explanation of the nature of OT. In 1998, a review of the Uniform Terminology number 3 was conducted by the AOTA. Surveys of practitioners and educators highlighted two major concerns. One, that terms needed to be updated and more comprehensive to reflect occupation-based practice. And two, that OT practitioners needed a document that could effectively guide education and practice. These needs arose in 1998 because there was a shift in healthcare to managed care. This meant that lengths of stay in hospitals shortened, and there was tighter control on spending of healthcare dollars. Some services traditionally performed in the hospital were now shifted to an outpatient basis or provided in the community. Each service had to be more accountable for what they provided and not duplicate other services provided. OTs were seeing that the medical model did not always fit and that they needed to clearly define OT to reconcile the long-held beliefs with the emerging demands in healthcare. A new document was needed to explain and communicate the value of OT. In other words, OT needed to own occupation once again. Out of this process came the Occupational Therapy Practice Framework, Domain and Process, which was adopted in 2002. The new OT Practice Framework included new International Classification of Function language, which is set by the World Health Organization. This was in order to be more consistent with other arenas of healthcare globally. Terms were chosen to be more understandable by other parties and the public. This new practice framework was also designed to broaden and define who we are in all areas of practice, not just physical rehabilitation. So it was more inclusive in emerging markets and community practice. Next, in 2008, the second edition of the Occupational Therapy Practice Framework was adopted. This version included updates to increase clarity, recognize co-occupations, underscore the significance of activity analysis, and to be more comprehensive with OT's role in social justice and advocacy. Finally, in 2014, the most current version, the Occupational Therapy Practice Framework, Domain and Process 3rd edition, was adopted. This version clarifies terms and categorizations, provides more specific definitions of performance skills, combines interventions into more meaningful groupings, and redefines clients to align with current practice trends. If we look at past trends, then we are probably going to see a newer version coming out in the near future. When looking at a framework, it may help to think of an analogy of a building. First, there is the foundation. This determines the footprint of the structure and the base upon which the rest of the building sits. This is like the base provided by the philosophy of OT, which we have already explored. All of OT sits on the philosophy. Next in a building is the frame. The frame gives the building its shape and function. By the frame, we know if the building will be a store, a house, a shed, or something else. The frame is recognizable to others and guides the use of the building. Similarly, a profession's framework organizes its body of knowledge so that there's a common language and consistency in actual practice. It gives the profession its function, and it makes the profession recognizable to others. Understand that a framework is meant to be dynamic. It is meant to evolve and change as new theories and models emerge. In the same way, we might remodel a building if we discover that we are using it differently than expected or new needs arise. Hopefully, this gives you a way of thinking about the professional framework, which helps to understand it. There are a few things I wanted to be sure you understand about the practice framework. One of those is that there are two parts to the OT practice framework. The first part is the domain. The domain explains what we address in practice and what we focus on with our clients. It tells the focus of our evaluations, interventions, and goals. The process tells how we deliver OT services. In OT, we view our clients and the therapy that occurs as a dynamic interaction with the client in the center. As therapists, we put the process of therapy into action in a careful, reasoned manner by applying our expertise as OTs. I want you to start thinking about clients as not only individuals, but groups and populations also. Let's continue learning about the domain. The domain is further subdivided into the following. I have listed the table and page number which corresponds to that area of the domain for you to follow along. For now, you should study the different subdivisions so that when we use these terms here and in other classes, you know what they are and what they aren't. Know the difference between performance skills and performance patterns, context and environments, and others. I will give you a brief introduction to each here. You may want to follow along in your book. The first is occupations. There are 8 categories of common occupations that we recognize as OTs. The OT Practice Framework classifies each occupation under one of these categories. Definitions are provided for each occupation. These are agreed upon definitions. Some occupations are categorized differently than you or I might typically think about them. One example might be functional mobility, which is an ADL, versus driving and community mobility, which is an IADL. Next is client factors. Client factors are the anatomy, physiology, psychology, and values associated in executing occupations. It is a holistic view. These are the things that make occupation unique to a person. Performance skills. These are the motor, sensory, emotional, cognitive, and social actions needed to engage in occupations. These actions, which are the smaller parts of completing a task or activity. For example, the task of writing includes performance skills of grips for gripping the pencil and manipulates to make the small movements required to write letters. Moving on to performance patterns. Performance patterns are the common behaviors that support or hinder the ongoing use of skills in occupations. The types of habits document, which is included in this week's resources, will explain this more. Lastly, under the domain is contexts and environments. These are internal and external conditions that influence the choice, use, and quality of occupations. Contexts are present within the client, and environments are external conditions. I want you to understand that the common idea in all of the domain is occupation. The different areas of the domain provide the pieces of the puzzle, and the whole picture of the puzzle at the end is participation in occupation. If the domain is the puzzle of participation in occupation, then the process is how we assemble the puzzle as OTs. The process attempts to organize delivery of OT services. Take a moment to pause the video and compare Figure 2 on page S10 and Exhibit 3 on page S17. When you are done, restart the video. When comparing these, you should have noticed that both Figure 2 and Exhibit 3 are illustrating the occupational therapy process. Figure 2 is more interconnected, showing an overview of how this process happens in real life. Exhibit 3 is more detailed and linear. It shows the different steps in the OT process in a sequential order. Exhibit 3 probably gives you a better understanding of what happens in the OT process, but Figure 2 is more realistic in terms of how it happens. The main idea to remember is that the process of occupational therapy is an integrated rather than a traditional linear process. Sometimes steps overlap, repeat, and feed into each other in complex ways. Next, look at Figure 3. This helps to describe how the process interacts with the domain. This may still seem very theoretical and ethereal right now. Be patient with yourself. You're only beginning to learn about these concepts. I would encourage you to read through the OT Practice Framework more than once in order to continue your understanding. You will get practice in other classes applying the Practice Framework as well. Next, you will complete your Practice Framework domain assignment. In it, you will apply what you are learning to your own occupations. Then, in the next assignment this week, you will use the case presentation at the end of Chapter 5 to apply your learning to that case. Do what you can, and then use your small groups to help each other in the process.